faithfully sharing value and interpreting great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally with Book Talk. Nowadays, we live in a globalized world. This means that decisions by one country often impact the whole globe. For example, in mid April 2021, Japan's government announced that once Fukushima nuclear plant's wastewater hits peak storage in the next 2 years, they'll release tens of thousands of tons of treated radioactive water into the ocean. It seems Japan's government thinks that dumping the nuclear waste into the sea means it's no longer their problem, solving the Fukushima mess for good. But this wastewater will spread through ocean currents to seas worldwide, severely harming coastal environments and residents' health. So while this decision might look responsible for their own people, it actually poses a huge risk to all of humanity. Beyond the nuclear wastewater issue, choices by single countries on things like climate change, terrorism, and refugee crises often affect everyone globally. Today, we're discussing the book How to Approach Globalization, where the author explores how we need to update traditional ethics to tackle global problems. The author, Peter Singer, was born in Australia and graduated from Cambridge's philosophy department. He's one of today's most influential philosophers. Peter Singer served as president of the International Ethics Association, always focused on modern moral issues, and he's a key advocate for the global animal liberation movement. His major works, like The Most Good You Can Do, Animal Liberation, and Animal Rights, have all been translated into Chinese. In How to Approach Globalization, Singer aims to examine globalization from a broader perspective. Essentially, he tackles four key problems in this book. First, with climate change getting worse, how should nations share the responsibility? Second, does global economics make our lives better or create more inequality? Third, atrocities against humanity happening within a single country. Should other countries step in to intervene? Fourth, why is helping strangers from far away ethically just as important as helping neighbors? Singer argues that, like it or not, we're all interconnected now, and navigating globalization safely depends on updating our ethical beliefs. In the past, people always prioritized national interests from the perspective of sovereign states. But now we must stand from the perspective of a global community of shared future, transcending narrow nationalism and sovereign limitations to reconsider what truly benefits all humanity. Next, we'll explore the book's content through the four problems mentioned earlier. First, let's examine the global climate change issue. Last century, scientists discovered a massive ozone hole over Antarctica. Even more alarming, it keeps expanding yearly, causing rising surface temperatures and increasingly evident global warming. Polar ice caps continue melting, sea levels accelerate upward, and even a single-degree global temperature rise brings drastic changes to Earth. This includes expanding tropical storms and hurricanes, spreading tropical diseases, intensified droughts and floods, and threats to food security. Low-lying nations may even be submerged by seawater. Climate issues affect everyone globally, transcending national borders. While all share climate change's consequences, impacts differ drastically between rich and poor nations. Wealthy nations can respond better, storing more food, building higher dams, while poor nations remain helpless. In 1991, a cyclone struck Bangladesh during high tide, leaving tens of millions homeless and over 100,000 dead. So most survivors had nowhere to go but continue living there. If sea levels keep rising in that delta region, 7 million people could be displaced. Beyond disaster response differences, rich and poor nations also vary greatly in carbon emissions. For example, due to industrialization differences, the U.S., sustaining economic growth, emits far more greenhouse gases than Bangladesh. This creates a paradoxical situation. Rich nations accelerate global warming yet possess means to withstand its disasters. So how should responsibilities be fairly distributed for climate change? From different ethical perspectives, we typically have four fairness principles. First is the historical principle. This means whoever breaks something must fix it. So we need to examine history to see who broke things first. For example, imagine a village with a river where villagers recklessly dump household waste. After the river got polluted, new immigrants arrived in the village. As the population grew, pollution worsened, and everyone couldn't use it anymore, forcing them to start cleaning up. According to the historical principle, the old villagers caused more pollution, so they bear more responsibility in cleaning up than the new villagers. For instance, the the old villagers can't dump waste anymore or have to pay a larger share of the cleanup costs. The same logic applies to atmospheric issues. Since developed countries caused more damage, they should take more responsibility to correct and compensate. Second is the present principle, different from the previous one. The present principle requires us to let go of the past. Regardless of what happened, from an abstract rights perspective, everyone is equal. For example, both new and old villagers have equal rights to use the river. We can't just revoke the old villagers' rights forever because of past mistakes. The atmosphere is also such a public resource. Although developed countries emitted far more greenhouse gases in the past, in terms of emission rights, all countries are equal. If we deprive a developed country of its emission rights, that would also be unfair. The third principle is the principle of helping the most vulnerable groups. People often don't choose their birth circumstances, so they can't be held responsible for their origins. In a village, some wealthy households can afford to degrade more waste themselves. Even if they don't dump it all in the river, they can maintain cleanliness. But poor villagers have no choice. They can't buy advanced equipment to handle waste at home, and if they don't dump it in the river, trash piles up, severely affecting their lives and health. Right. And therefore, the village should allocate more waste dumping quotas to these poor villagers and not demand extra cleanup fees from them. Similarly, when distributing emission allowances for atmospheric issues, we must consider the actual capabilities of rich and poor countries, at least giving some leeway to poor nations. And lastly is the greatest happiness principle. This principle involves utilitarian calculation to see how we can maximize total happiness and minimize suffering for everyone. For example, we could allocate part of the river cleanup budget to help poor villagers with their pressing needs. This way, while the river may not be fully cleaned, at least no one starves, and it might even improve the poor's well-being to some extent. The author believes these four principles, while distinct, must be integrated when addressing global climate issues. Under the present principle, everyone should have equal future shares of the atmosphere. Rich and poor nations alike should receive equal carbon emission allowances. Based on historical and vulnerable group principles, developed nations with high per capita emissions should lead by drastically reducing their targets. Of course, wealthy nations slashing emissions drastically could hamper global economic growth. So under the greatest happiness principle, we could allow carbon trading between nations exceeding and those below emission targets. For instance, a country like the US, exceeding its limit, could buy emission allowances from Bangladesh. This trading helps the US meet goals while motivating Bangladesh to maintain low emissions and maximize sellable quotas. All right, let's summarize the first part. Global warming is globalization's foremost challenge, threatening humanity's survival and requiring collective efforts. But on this issue, rich and poor nations have conflicting interests and differing disaster response capacities. Therefore, emission-limiting measures must integrate all four principles: historical, present, helping the vulnerable, and greatest happiness. While analyzing climate issues, we've seen global wealth disparity. So, will further economic globalization alleviate or worsen this gap? In the book's second part, the author examines economic globalization controversies through the World Trade Organization. The author acknowledges global capitalism's flaws but argues against halting economic globalization. Instead, we should seek ways to improve these issues. Now let's see how the author specifically addresses this. Since its founding, the WTO has faced constant resistance and skepticism, with these criticisms accompanying its development. Here, we can summarize four representative criticisms. The first criticism is that the WTO prioritizes economic interests above all else, neglecting environmental, animal, and human welfare. For example, there's a highly efficient method of shrimp fishing. But this method kills endangered sea turtles, and environmentalists condemn the WTO for ignoring this and allowing such shrimp in international markets. The WTO has formally responded to this criticism. Actually, the WTO permits member states to protect animals and environments, provided it's done fairly and not used as disguised trade barriers. For instance, in parts of the Pacific, dolphin pods swim above tuna schools. So, some countries trap and drown dolphins to catch tuna. The U.S. deemed this a violation of its Marine Mammal Protection Act, banning tuna imports from such countries, leading Mexico to file a WTO complaint. But the WTO ruled that if the U.S. avoids double standards and treats all equally, such measures are legitimate protections, not trade barriers. The second criticism argues that economic globalization tramples national sovereignty. In reality, governments face huge pressure maintaining WTO membership, as joining requires obeying rules, where trade agreements heavily influence major decisions. This indeed weakens national sovereignty. However, the author believes WTO benefits may outweigh accepting some constraints. Consider this example. In 2001, South Africa, 1 in 5 people had HIV or AIDS.
To manage the virus, patients needed $10,000 yearly.
For critical drugs, this cost made them completely unaffordable for ordinary people. These drugs primarily came from U.S. pharmaceutical companies. So South Africa sought to override patents during the crisis, enabling local production to make drugs affordable. Well, this immediately provoked international pharmaceutical companies' interests, sparking their strong opposition. To protect pharmaceutical companies' intellectual property, the U.S. threatened South Africa with trade sanctions, but this sparked outrage among the American public, leading the U.S. drug firms to drop lawsuits and agree to provide products to African nations for free or at deep discounts. Due to this incident, at the 2001 WTO Doha conference, member states reached a consensus that countries can take extraordinary measures to protect public health. Other countries cannot interfere, and each member has the right to judge what constitutes an emergency, allowing them to break rules in critical situations. Protection of intellectual property for essential medicines. Thus, while the WTO influences national decisions, it also demands governments resist pressure from narrow domestic interest groups and prioritize broader public interests. Next, we'll discuss the third type of criticism. This view holds that economic globalization affects everyone but is always dominated by a small group of wealthy nations, whose trade deals benefit only themselves. For example, until the 1999 Seattle Conference, the WTO's agenda was set by major trading powers through informal talks. This group was called the Quad, consisting of the US, EU, Japan, and Canada. Once they reached consensus, outcomes were presented to formal meetings, often as a done deal, with weaker nations rarely able to voice opposition. Facing this criticism, the author argues that with globalization's advance, developing countries are rising, and the WTO is no longer dominated by a few nations as before. For instance, in 2003, when the US and EU agreed on an agricultural trade proposal, it was unexpectedly opposed by a group of developing countries led by Brazil. The latter insisted on their rights in negotiations, thus breaking the Quad's dominance. Of course, ensuring the interests of developing nations, especially the least developed, still has a long way to go. The fourth criticism argues that economic globalization exacerbates inequality, even creating a trend of robbing the poor to benefit the rich. For example, after India, joined global trade, it exported more food. Some say that India, being a populous country with insufficient rice for itself, still exports it. As a result, domestic food prices doubled. The poor increasingly can't afford to eat. The author believes we should look at it this way. We should focus on improving overall human welfare. A society with a few billionaires but high average living standards is still better than one where everyone is equal but poor. But in a society where everyone is poor, if we divide people into income brackets and examine the effects of economic globalization, we'll find that from 1988 to 2008, incomes for middle and high income groups grew by 40% to 80%. Meanwhile, the population in extreme poverty has been decreasing since 1990. If we consider indicators like health and quality of life, even those in the lowest income brackets have seen welfare improvements. Economic globalization does make the rich richer, but it also lifts all boats, helping the poor. Of course, increasing inequality can also hinder economic growth and even undermine democracy. While advancing the welfare of all society members, we should still strive to narrow the wealth gap and reduce inequality. Now let's summarize the content of the second part. The author acknowledges that the WTO still has many issues needing improvement, but its flaws don't overshadow its merits, and many criticisms of economic globalization are biased. And so, we can definitely keep improving in the process of advancing economic globalization, such as strengthening awareness of environmental and animal protection, listening more to weaker nations, and reducing the wealth gap while enhancing overall welfare. Moreover, under the WTO's constraints, some selfish behaviors are restrained, leading to more consideration of humanity's interests. In the globalization era, besides climate and economic issues, cross-border legal jurisdiction is also a new phenomenon. Throughout human history, there have always been appalling wars and massacres. In the early 20th century, Turks massacred approximately 1.5 million Armenians, and the Nazis' genocide plan killed approximately 6 million Jews. Just as laws are needed within a country to protect citizens, at the international level, laws are also necessary to defend humanity from genocide and similar crimes. Therefore, in the third part of this book, the author discusses a new situation in the globalization era. Countries cannot hide behind sovereignty to commit inhumane atrocities. Especially when atrocities occur, other countries cannot stand by idly. They have a responsibility to intervene through proper humanitarian procedures. First, let's examine how international law defines crimes against humanity. Now, at the end of World War II, the Allies established the International Military Tribunal specifically to try Nazi war criminals, enacting the Nuremberg Charter. The charter granted Nuremberg Tribunal jurisdiction over three crimes: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Those who commit such crimes can be tried by international courts, regardless of their nation's domestic laws. In theory, this applies even if the country where crimes occurred hasn't signed international accountability conventions. So, any nation has the right to prosecute perpetrators of crimes against humanity. A famous example is the trial of WWE war criminal Adolf Eichmann. During World War II, he implemented the Nazi genocide against Jews and was known as the executioner. After the war, he fled but was captured in Argentina and extradited to Jerusalem for trial. He was executed in Israel. Though German, his crimes in Germany were universally recognized as crimes against humanity. Thus, Israel's Supreme Court had jurisdiction to try him. Yet despite international criminal law, genocide and crimes against humanity persist globally. For example, therefore, the author argues nations capable of preventing such crimes must protect potential victims, even through intervention. Such interventions require approval through legal procedures. Broadly, this protection involves three steps. First, the UN mandates states to protect citizens from four crimes: genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Second, the international community commits to helping nations fulfill these responsibilities. If nations lack capacity, assistance must build their capability to uphold these duties. Finally, if a state fails to protect citizens, UN members must take timely, decisive humanitarian action. Of course, this final step isn't solely military. Any force used must comply with the UN Charter. Moreover, with the approval of the Security Council, in practice, authorization by the Security Council is decided by the votes of permanent members, ensuring that UN military interventions serve the common good of humanity. For example, in the 1990s, the UN intervened to stop Iraq's oppression of the Kurds, and peacekeeping forces entered Somalia to intervene in their civil war, all authorized by the Security Council. All right, let's summarize the content of the third part. In the era of globalization, although we still live in sovereign states, national sovereignty is no longer absolute, and it cannot be used to harm humanity's true interests. And in response to this phenomenon, international law has begun to establish cross-border jurisdiction to combat crimes against humanity. When a government fails to protect its people, international organizations or other nations must step up to jointly shoulder the responsibility of protecting all humanity, ensuring no one suffers from crimes against humanity. In a global community, we naturally cannot stand idly by when the most brutal atrocities occur. Then, when people are in ordinary hardship, do we have a moral obligation to help? In traditional views, we always prioritize helping those close to us, such as family, neighbors in the same community, or even people of the same ethnicity. But in the fourth part of this book, the author emphasizes that in the globalization era, we should break through this narrow-mindedness. Morally speaking, helping foreigners should be as natural as helping acquaintances. So what reasons compel us to do so? The author gives 3 reasons. First, if we only care about our own compatriots, we overlook those in other countries who need help more urgently. After the 9/11 attacks, Americans provided an avalanche of aid to victims' families with nearly $2 billion from state and private donations, which is understandable, but the aid extended to the entire southern Manhattan area, with each household receiving over $5,000 in subsidies. At the same time, UNICEF released a report. The report showed that over 10 million children worldwide still die from malnutrition, water issues, and lack of basic medical facilities.
On September 11th alone, over 30,000 children died from these causes, 10 times the number of September 11th victims.
They haven't received sufficient aid from the U.S., and clearly, compared to families in Manhattan who suffered no casualties, these impoverished children and their families struggling for survival need help more urgently. Second, if we only favor people with blood ties or the same race as us, we easily fall into racist tendencies. We are not unfamiliar with many lessons from history. For a simple example, a Nazi officer who believed only Aryans had the noblest blood, without considering if this idea violated other races' human rights, would lead to slaughter, causing more Jews to die unjustly. Therefore, when we care about a group, we shouldn't rely solely on factors like bloodline, skin color, or race, but rather see if the group respects more people's rights. Okay, so conversely, if our community is culturally constructed, we can easily imagine ourselves in a larger global community caring for more people's well-being. Third, if helping our fellow citizens helps reduce inequality within society, then when we are more just, compassionate, and able to aid strangers abroad, it helps reduce inequality between societies. Okay. These two can coexist. It's not an either-or issue. Moreover, sometimes with minimal cost, we can save a stranger's life or fundamentally change their life. For example, the cost to save Bangladeshi refugees is only 1/30th of manufacturing a jet airliner for developed countries, and donating a mosquito net for malaria-prone areas in Africa costs just $7.5. This is like the cost of saving a drowning child being just ruining a new pair of Nike running shoes. Therefore, aid issues should concern every citizen of wealthy countries. At this point, the main content of the book, How to Approach Globalization, has been introduced. Finally, let's review the core content of this book. In this globalization era, more and more issues require global solutions. No country can independently decide its future. We should no longer judge with traditional ethical views. Whether environmental issues, free trade, or international law and foreign aid, national sovereignty is no longer supreme. Sovereign states in the globalization era are subject to various constraints. Peter Singer, this ethicist, calls for transcending narrow national boundaries to reconsider the well-being of more people and ultimately build a global community for a better world. As we know, the great maritime discoveries of the 15th and 16th centuries connected the world. The 18th century Declaration of Independence first solemnly proclaimed universal human rights. The 20th century conquest of outer space truly allowed humanity to see this planet as one world from beyond Earth. Thus, the task of the 21st century is to develop governance forms suitable for our world. Will the future world become better? Undoubtedly. It depends on how we now break free from the past and make new choices from a global human perspective. All right, that concludes our introduction to the book, How to Approach Globalization.
Farewell, inviting notes are below the audio, and we'll see you next time.